So there really, if you're interested in those technical areas, the subsequent sessions in coming weeks will focus on these more specifically. So this really is a very brisk overview, let's say, of the areas that are touched upon in that. But I do want to take just a minute or two on the legislative and policy remit areas. So section 1 is a kind of introduction. It really sets out the scene in the document. So what we're trying to do is to recognise that buildings built today are still likely to be around in the net zero world required by 2050, and that's been kind of legislated for. So we need to start. Really do need to be building today for the standards of tomorrow if we can. And the purpose of our discussion document is to provide an early outline of potential proposals to get us towards that and onto that pathway, to inform and explore these kind of challenges and see where we're at. It's not just for individuals in industry and architects and people out there building, it's also for other related policy makers, people involved and connected with what we're doing or who may be impacted, and materials suppliers, people like that. It also considers alternative approaches that looks at what other approaches and what other regions are doing. And really what we're trying to do most of all is encourage industry and enforcement to get ready and to prepare for the kind of quite extensive changes that are going to be needed. So we're seeking evidence, data and views on a wide range of things. It goes from quite general scale open questions to really quite specific scale on specific things where we have kind of greater certainty on potential next steps and what we're looking to do. But in all cases, and just to reassure people, at this stage, this is a discussion. It's a pre-consultation. So there really will need to be a further consultation with finalised or more finalised draft technical booklets, impact assessments, all those kind of things required before any of these changes are implemented. But what we're trying to do at this stage, I suppose, is to highlight the progress or the thinking of where we are to date, and to have an early warning back from society, or if there are any particular issues or showstoppers, or if there's a direction of travel that we need to look at differently before we get to that much more refined and detailed set of proposals. So in terms of overall context, this document is the second phase of a 5-phase programme that was announced as part of the energy strategy. As I've said there, the first phase was an uplift that was implemented back in June. This is the second phase. The third phase will be an uplift that we would consult on, and that was expected really to follow the developments that have been introduced recently in the last 6 months to a year in England and elsewhere. And then there will be future developments after that to try and take into account developments in other regions that might happen over the course of 2025. So with potential further review then in 2029 or 2030, so some years after that. But that's the broad sort of effort that we're trying to meet. That's the context of where we're at, and that's why we're where we're at today. So of course, overarching all of this and very important, it would be the carbon commitments and the Climate Change Act after the recent Northern Ireland Climate Change Act. Obviously, we fit within the residential and public buildings reporting sectors, but also in the electricity reporting sector, electrical savings are reported there. So that's another aspect of what we're doing. The document runs through how we're interconnected in the kind of mesh or framework of other areas. So if we take it by departmental roles, DERA runs the climate change and coordinates and issues like that. It also has responsibilities for coordination or a bit of guidance, or emphasises rural needs policies. Department for the Economy then, of course, is central to the energy strategy. It has responsibility on energy efficiency, on the electricity grid, renewables, gas, overarching heat policy, heat networks, issues, regulations, things like that. Department for Communities deals with housing policy, not just social housing, all housing policy, and of course has a special emphasis on fuel poverty. We in building regulations sit within the Department of Finance. We also have responsibility for EPCs, and the department has responsibility on public procurement, business case, and I suppose, the overall finance to fund this great changes that are expected to kind of happen or to help with that in the road to net zero. Department for Infrastructure, of course, deals with planning and deals with transport, and that includes electric vehicle charge point infrastructure. And then it's very important to remember that a lot of this is really scoped with UK government oversight. So there are a lot of issues, particularly traditional EU liaison issues on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the EPBD, how that should be interpreted, what that had meant. That was always scoped or worked with the UK government at the core of things, and that influence still remains in that they're the central driving force behind the national calculation methodology and software that gets used in energy assessments for building regulations and EPCs. They also govern UK or GB product standards. So if there were a minimum efficiency requirements for a boiler or things like that, a lot of that would be governed through themselves. And of course, the Northern Ireland Protocol influences that as well, because is it GB or UK product standard that needs to apply when that's being installed here or bought here. And of course, the UK government also has responsibility on most taxation issues, and that can be very influential. You know, the taxation that's set on fuels can massively affect the fuel pricing. The taxation that's set on VAT on building work obviously can affect whether existing buildings are how they're treated and how the costs of work to them is treated. So that, and for example, the recent relaxation on VAT on photovoltaics and things, that all feeds into the outcomes that we are trying to shape or get to. So if some fuels or some technologies are particularly expensive or affected by that, that impacts ourselves. So we sit in a kind of mixture of all of these policies and influences, and I think it's really important that that's appreciated by people when they expect building regulations change to occur. So our legislation only applies when building work is being done. So that's a really important thing to remember. We don't require work to be done to bring a building up to a fitness standard. We don't require retrofit of a building to be done. What we require is, if you are doing work, that work is done to a certain standard. So that's a really important aspect of building regulations. They're not there to require buildings to be existing buildings to be brought up to scratch. They only apply when building work is being done. The remit is set by the primary legislation. So it's, again, standards which can reasonably be attained or and they usually set general functional requirements to be reasonable or adequate. And then the definition or the expectation or examples of what reasonable or adequate looks like is normally provided in the technical booklets. And those technical booklets form the day-to-day guidance that most of you, I expect, are familiar with. Finally, they've also implemented aspects of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. That's a bit of legislation and that's been implemented via Part F. And some aspects of this are still to be provided, for example, a primary energy target, and they stem from an amendment to the directive made in 2018. But ongoing EPBD compliance into the future is no longer a requirement for the UK, having left the EU, and we don't expect that will be a requirement that will be imposed or applied here. So that's an important kind of thing. So we have a couple of questions on legislative issues that I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to explore. They are the time frame for the coming into force of new standards and the issue about a general legislative refresh in light of those changes from the EU. So moving as quickly as I can, England applied quite interesting transitional provisions so that its new regulations came to apply to all new applications made after the regulations come into operation. So that first line is kind of normal. If you make your application after the new regulations come into operation, the new standards of regulations apply. But the interesting difference with England's last amendment was that they also applied it such that all building work not commenced within 1 year of the new regulations having come into operation, whether the plans were previously submitted and approved or not, would also be subject to the uplifted requirements. So it didn't matter that you'd made your application a year and a half ago and finally got a plans approval. If you hadn't commenced within a year of the new requirements coming into operation, if you hadn't commenced your building, then you're expected to meet the standard of the new standards. Now, that was done in the context, we believe, in England, where there were things like large site-wide applications being made for estates of houses, and provided one of the houses had commenced, that was the application commenced, and so the 200th house or whatever years later was still able to continue through the process under the previous under the application, the first application, the standards from many years previous. Our regulation 10, deposit of plans for the erection of 2 or more buildings that are or contain dwellings, already prevents these the most egregious cases of that here. And we also have concerns on a range of kind of legislative concepts around the approach that England have if it were to be applied here. So, for example, contravention notices might be difficult to apply because contravention notices can't be issued if a building is constructed in accordance with approved plans. So if the plans were approved 2 or 3 years ago but are only now commencing, then there could be difficulties there. We also think there are consequential impacts, and there's a kind of and there's a general conflict with Article 19 of the Order, which I'd hope to come on to. So Article 19 of the Order, which is the primary legislation and sits above the secondary regulations themselves. Article 19 of the Order makes it clear that district councils have the power, if the work hasn't commenced within 3 years of the deposit, of the receipt of the deposit of plans, then the councils can declare that the deposit of plans shall be of no effect. So effectively, if you make your deposit and then haven't commenced the work within 3 years, your application is void. You have to reapply, and that has been quite a straightforward concept. And we're concerned that transitional provisions, as they were implemented in England, might conflict with this process. It would seem somewhat odd to have those two levels of legislation in conflict or a challenge. And similarly then, we've got the, as I've said before, we've got this previous position under Regulation 10 that each building which contains a dwelling is considered a separate application or a separate deposit for the purposes of Article 19 at the minute in any case. So we feel that that gives quite a bit of support or protection on that front. So our proposals in the document, which we're open to receive comment on, are that we should continue in the basis that we have, so that applications submitted before new regulations are coming into operation can continue under the standards that applied at the date the application was made, but that would remain subject to the commencement within 3 years of the application. However, we would be open to considering if this 3-year time period should be reduced, and if so, what to. So we've asked questions around that, and we'd be really interested in your comments on that. Similarly, we've had a bit of a look, and we think that there's a fair bit of scope for some legislative refresh on the regulations themselves. Particularly, there's a number there that come in through the EU and the various, I suppose, layers of EU, and the need to have demonstrate a very rigorous transposition that is both fulsome transposition but hasn't had any unnecessary gold plating, has tended to lead to some maybe slightly eccentric or complex wording in the outcomes. So examples of that, if people have time to look at them, are Regulation 43A, consideration of high efficiency alternative systems, Regulation 43B, nearly zero energy requirements for new buildings. In effect, they're requirements that now apply to all new buildings. So we don't really see how you don't just have standards for new buildings rather than explicitly taking out that wording. So we think that there's room for a kind of clean up on some of these issues. And we think that we know that there'll be more specific and detailed legislative proposals needed to be developed on this, but we're open to your opinion on this. and to receiving anything that you might think about on this at this stage. Our intention really isn't, it genuinely isn't to make the process less onerous or to avoid EU the overall ambition or aim or intent. The real intention here is to have a simpler approach. Can the wording of the actual language of the legislation help deliver a slightly more straightforward set of guidance that's easier for industry to follow, without diminishing at all the rigor that's needed or the standards that are required. Our next section, section 2B, looks at developments elsewhere. So it's trying to provide a kind of overarching context, trying to explain to people why we tend to have such a reliance on developments in England and other nations, and how we learn from other places. So there are lots of reasons for this. It's been recommended since the foundation of building regulations policy and legislation in Northern Ireland that the developments should be amended in light of developments in England. So our regulations should be amended in that context. Reasons for it are really simply resource efficiency at the policy development end, and it can be awkward and difficult if 3 or 4 administrations go off on their own particular tangents without it can just lead to lots of complexity or different ways of doing things, sometimes just for the sake of being different. Sometimes it's for the good, of course, and because there's particular climatic conditions or reasons, and that's fine. We're open to that, but the general expectation is here that it improves our resource efficiency and helps us to benefit from lessons learned and implementation elsewhere prior to application here. It's really important, I think, in Part F terms, because we're really embedded with the national calculation methodology and the complexity that comes with that, the development of software, and the use of various kind of comparative target notional buildings and notional dwellings, and that's all explained a bit more in the consultation. And there's also an interconnection with the assessments needed for EPCs, and that's the software and the assessor accreditation that we've spoken about. So it's that whole picture means that we're particularly kind of embedded and connected with England and the UK government and its developments on that side of things. The recent Phase 1 amendments that we made to Part F technical booklets really were a temporary deviation from this. It was in light of a need to kind of do something urgently. And it was it's not really a long-term or sustainable position to go off on our own track. And the intention is to kind of come back and realign with England, or at least take account of England and the developments elsewhere. And given the extent of the inter-alliance and the policy complexities that come, so we think it's important to emphasise that. So we have some general questions then in section 2B that follow up on that, and where we're trying to just be sensitive to our local conditions. So we note that it can be difficult to compare the actual performance depending what metric you use, depending whether you take account of local weather data and things like that, depending whether you have absolute figures. There's quite a lot of scope for variance. So we're interested in if anyone has done any research, or if there is a true comparator or whatever that industry or academics have done to kind of benchmark using a rigorously consistent application method, buildings which would comply in the different administrations and how they kind of perform. We think that would be a helpful thing for ourselves to know, and to see what's actually been built, of course, as well. We'd also be interested in the characteristics of our local market. We outline in the document how, we tend to have smaller developers. We tend to have we obviously have a much higher level of reliance on oil, home heating fuel. We've got different ways of looking at fuel poverty and considering that, but we think we've a higher level of fuel poverty and that here as well. So we're asking about these issues, and if there are any other issues that we've missed in that filter or that way of looking at ourselves that need to be considered. And then question 2B.3 points to England's future homes ambitions and Annex C. So Annex C lists out the future direction of travel and things that are likely to happen. And we're basically kind of asking, are you content or do you agree with the kind of phase 3, 4, 5 approach, or do you think we should wait a little longer and just do one uplift, or where do you think we should go with that? Although later sections in this and some of the proposals might re-inform how you might choose to answer that question. So that is kind of our more detailed overview or detailed look at the first section, and I really have to move on to a kind of lightning tour of what's actually proposed then for the rest of the exercise. So we're looking in phase 3 to broadly build on or replicate and reflect upon the FLOSS amendments of England. So their part F was ventilation, their part L was their conservation of fuel and power, part O was overheating, and part S was for EV electric charging point infrastructure. And section 3 of our document deals with dwellings, section 4 deals with buildings other than dwellings. But that's where they're all covered, and that's what we've looked at. Section 5 of our document looks at longer term developments, and section 6 looks at some of these concurrent issues that might be considered either in the longer term or alongside improvements in operational energy performance and improvements in the methodology. So broadly, of course, phase 3 is expecting to lower operational emissions in terms of part F, conservation of fuel and power. Phase 3 is expected to lower our operational emissions, start really significantly move us away from higher carbon fuels, improve energy efficiency of new buildings and update the standards where work is carried out to existing buildings, and make use of the energy assessment, the new energy assessment methodology in that, which has come through that SAP 10 and SBEM version 6, I think it is, in England, and adopt those as they've now come through, and now that they're available, we can see what the impacts of them may be here. So within that, however, under pressure from some of our colleagues in other departments and other places, we're also seeking evidence as to whether there might be an option to take some additional time and to develop proposals with the effect that new build homes, so this is dwellings only, would be limited to only very low carbon heating solutions. So there are two options in relation to homes. One is a kind of, broadly follow England or the other administration approach reasonably closely. And the second option would be to take a more radical step, take some more time, see if it were possible to develop an approach where we have an expectation of only very low carbon heating solutions. With that in mind, there are two notional dwellings proposals in the document. So you'll see this table. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but this black column at the header is the existing kind of specification that we think might applies, would be a compliant specification that would work and would meet the current requirements under the last uplift that we introduced. And then what we have here are the proposed notional dwelling. It is the same fabric, and actually it's the same lighting standards as well for both options. But one is a building which should be heated with mains gas and have wastewater heat recovery, and would also have photovoltaics on the roof. And that's in line with the option that England has adopted. So that would be a follow England approach, the light green, and it's option 1. Option 2, the darker green, is a heat pump led solution, and it aligns with a specification that England provided in their Appendix D of their technical guidance, their approved document L1. I mean, we have to say, please don't underestimate the challenges in any of this. There are huge challenges in option 1. One is obviously the removal of fuel factors is a big thing, so that even buildings with or dwellings with using a fuel worse than gas would now be 100% compared to gas. There would be no relaxations or fuel factor allowances which currently exist, which would effectively make it really very difficult for home heating oil or similar high carbon fuels to be used. And so that then has a fuel cost impact because the lower carbon fuels seem to be more expensive to use. So that's a really significant issue. There's also potential rural disparity in that all of those homes in the rural areas wouldn't have access to gas. So if they can't meet this sort of gas and PV lead specification, they're then left with quite restricted options about what they can do. So rural homes or homes off the gas network could be more expensive to build and to run potentially. There are the other aspect to what we've included is a requirement for low temperature heating. So we've suggested a design flow temperature of 55 degrees as a maximum design flow temperature, and that's going to be a new challenge. Heating will be different. It will require different reassessment by designers. Heating installers and designers will have new ways of doing things. Radiators will be larger than they would have been, but then they'll be in better insulated buildings, so they may on average look the same as conventional radiators, but they will operate at lower temperatures. And the other issue to be mindful of within all of this is that SAP 10 overestimates the current extent of local electricity decarbonisation. So the carbon factor that's applied to electricity in SAP 10 as it stands is looking at the UK average, whereas our Northern Ireland average has a higher amount of carbon in it. And that's because I think we've been burning coal in Kilroot, and because we don't have the nuclear component to our mix. So even though we've quite a high renewables contribution, we don't have the same carbon performance. So there's a mismatch there between what SAP might say when you do your assessment and what the actual carbon performance really is. So there are similar issues with option 2, but many of them kind of get magnified, and there are some particularly niggly or difficult problems that we would have if option 2 were to be taken forward. So obviously you have running costs, because low carbon fuels tend to be more expensive, even if you are running a heat pump. That's what we have found in our assessment anyway. We're open to evidence. CapEx costs, capital expenditure costs, tend to go up as well. We've an interesting question about what the appropriate specification would be for a heat pump. I mean, maybe there's something there that we need to look at in what we've proposed, so keen to hear what you have. Industry skills and capacity pressures obviously increase because there's more new technology expectation in option 2 than there is in option 1. There are potential grid issues with all these heat pumps suddenly now sort of coming on the market, particularly in rural areas, which would also apply in option 1. There are kind of contrasting pressures actually with option 1, because in option 1, the high amount of photovoltaics could lead to issues in gaining export back to the grid, whereas with option 2, the issue is with supply to fund to keep the heat pump going, and for that to work whilst decarbonising the grid, so increasing the extent of electrical use whilst decarbonising the grid. We worry that there could be unintended outcomes if you have a very low emissions target established by a heat pump-led notional dwelling. Will it be able to provide the level of cooling that's needed and still meet the target? Because you now are going to have requirements for cooling under the overheating assessment requirement, and that might, in some building types, in some flats and things, require mechanical cooling if it goes that way. We're not clear how, under a heat pump-led proposal, you would assess heat networks. There are some quite specific issues that we do examine in detail on how heat networks are assessed under option 1, and we don't see the same direction or options available under option 2. So there could be quite some difficult times struggling to get that to work. We also wonder what alternatives there would be if heat pumps weren't able to be available because of grid supply issues. We note that if you go with a pure heat pump-led notional dwelling, is that leaving you closed to hybrid heat pumps, which could be coming onto the market? It's certainly something that GB product standards and that are looking at. And there might be benefits in hybrids, and that might give a backup option or an alternative option for the way forward. And of course, we have the same UK versus local grid issue again, but it becomes even more significant when you look at a heat pump-led solution. So the other point to bear in mind is that option 2 is again a significant deviation from what's already in place in England. So I wouldn't want to underestimate the extent of work that would be involved in deviating away from where England were. or in following somewhere else. If the more we can do that, the faster we can implement our proposals, and probably the more straightforward it would be for industry, because they'd be learning or they'd be developing on what they would have learned from England, and that involves assessor training, all sorts of things, as well as practical application on the ground. Okay, so those are the two sort of notional dwellings that are considered. There are also new metrics that would apply across all options. So obviously the emissions metric still remains, target emissions and DER, your target emission and your dwelling, and your target emission rate and your dwelling emission rate. Obviously, when we adopt the new system, you would no longer need the manual alterations that we currently apply for ANZ assessments. There would then be a new primary energy assessment, and that's discussed in the document, a fabric energy efficiency standard assessment, a FEES assessment. So that is really quite rigorous, because it's aligned with the notional dwelling specification, and it's quite substantial. That's quite tough. There are also improved limiting U values and air tightness standards, and improved limiting services efficiencies. We do discuss alternative metrics. So Scotland are looking at a delivered energy as an important metric in their EPCs and in their building regulations. Wales, for example, have a running cost, an EPC band, which might be something that we look at, particularly if we come to look at biofuels and things like that. We'd have to consider that maybe, but that's what that is. And Ireland, of course, have a renewable energy ratio. So we've looked at it, and our kind of thought was that the metrics A to E were sufficiently robust, but we're interested in your opinion on the rest of them. We also discussed fuel viability. So this table, table 3A.4, outlines what we think would be viable under the two options. Effectively, option 2 is limited really to heat pumps and hybrid heat pumps, possibly if there's photovoltaics, and we would like them to be able to use heat networks, but we think it's uncertain or difficult to see. There would be quite a bit of policy delivery needed on that. Whereas option 1, both oil and wood products tend to suffer and become difficult to see how they would be viable. That's kind of how that's looking. But again, we're interested in your comments, or if you've any experience from application in England or anything else, please do give us the feedback on that. And then there are issues that are common to both options, obviously, that we've outlined previously. So limiting the fabric standards, air tightness. We talk briefly about block averaging and whether there should be limits to that to prevent, say, highly glazed penthouse flats or something. We look at services efficiencies. There's a bit there about including for water efficiency. There's stuff about renewables connections, and then there's some procedural issues that are following what has been implemented in England. So that's as-built information in the home user guide, geolocated photo evidence, and the incorporation of the services guidance, the domestic building or non-domestic building services compliance guide information into the technical booklets. That's all there. There's also an interesting annex, Annex B, which looks at sort of outcomes for a typical semi-detached house. Now, when we develop proposals further, we'll have to look at that at a wider range of dwellings. But what's interesting here, and we just wanted to draw your attention to, is if you look at the third row down, these are the SAP 10.2, current SAP 10.2 cost assumptions about what the regulated energy use for heating, cooking, ventilation, and lighting only might be under various scenarios. Scenario 1, 2, and 3. Scenario 1 is existing average building. Scenario 2 and 3 are Part F compliant gas and oil buildings. The light green are compliant with option 1 only. The dark green are compliant with both option 1 or option 2 outcomes. So this column here then gives us, this row gives us the outcomes that SAP uses to calculate the SAP rating. So the problem being that those SAP 10.2 costs were estimated prior to the invasion of Ukraine and things, so they're really not in kilter with true reflection of where we're at. We have taken those and recalibrated them to our local running costs. So this is the kind of typical running costs. And interestingly, heating, ventilation, cooking, and lighting, there's quite a discrepancy here between gas and oil, for example, emerges. Now, it's not of the same significance when you add in 2,400 kilowatt hours a year for electricity use. And add that to the system, and that's what the kind of bottom line household total bill might be under the modelled assessment. So that's our efforts at where it kind of comes out. And what's interesting there is that option 1 is actually a cheaper to run option than option 2. So although option 2 saves much more carbon, it's a fair bit more expensive. It's about £600 there more expensive in terms of running costs than option 1. And principal to that really is the photovoltaic array seems to be the very substantial figure. And scenario 8 adds that photovoltaic array and better fabric to try and bring that down, with the suggestion in our consultation that might be the basis or a starting point or a consideration for a future notional dwelling for later phases, for phase 4 or for phase 5. So that's kind of how that has panned out. But it kind of emphasises to us, I suppose, that the SAP 10 running cost assumptions really aren't quite up there. So we'll be looking at that soon. So in terms of proposals for existing dwellings, these are much less limited, so it should be a bit faster to explain, hopefully. But you're looking at if you're doing an equivalent target approach or similar to the as an alternative way of demonstrating compliance for an extension or a material alteration, you'd now need to build in the fees and the primary energy assessment as well as the emissions assessment. So that would be there. We're interested in trying to develop a better emphasis or a call for specialist judgment when dealing with traditional buildings and vapor permeable construction. We're looking at an uplift to standards so that new elements would be broadly similar to new build fabric elements, be roughly the same kind of outcomes there. There are less significant change to retrofit standards because we're worried about the risks of unintended consequences from moisture and issues like that. Services efficiency uplifts are there as well. Big issue would be that replacement heating system. If someone's replacing their entire heating system, not if they're just doing a radiator, not if they're just doing a boiler, but if they're replacing their entire heating system, it would be expected to be installed with a low temperature system. Similarly, what else have I got here? Yes, the new primary energy assessment. Yes, there would be a new primary energy assessment when you were changing fuel. So as well as the emissions assessment you have to do now, you'd have to do the primary energy emissions assessment too, so that your new fuel that you moved to was no worse, both in emissions and in primary energy performance terms. And that wouldn't be applied where the heat loss of the dwelling was really very low. But other than that, that would be applicable, and that has some interesting outcomes that people should look at, particularly if they're from a fuel industry side of things. There are we talk about consequential improvements, and we also look at major renovations with a view to seeking evidence from the Republic of Ireland's approach. We're sceptical on both of these kind of areas, although we do have a set of proposals there to learn from Wales, so that if you were doing an extension to a dwelling and the existing building needed loft insulation, cylinder jacket or cavity wall insulation, then you would really be expected to do that as part of the extension work. So that's been included there, and we'd suggest people look at that. Moving swiftly on, proposals for non-domestic buildings then. We've got new notional buildings similar to the notional dwellings. However, in this case, we really are just looking at what's out there. We're not even suggesting that Northern Ireland has the scope or capacity to try and develop its own particular notional building, because the outcomes from that can be really very variable and complex and could affect, there's such a variety of building types and building situations to consider that we think that it's not really realistic for us to do that. There is, however, a bit of a comparison provided in Annex D of England, Wales and Scotland's notional buildings, outlining what the differences they have, which are all relatively minor, dare I say, or seem that way at this stage. We've got, of course, the fundamental change is in what your comparative fuel is between your actual building and your notional building. So a bit like the fuel factors that applied in notional dwellings, that would, if you have a carbon factor worse than gas, you would be compared to gas. So again, in existing buildings then, or sorry, in non-domestic buildings, you would find that you wouldn't be able to use oil or higher carbon fuels very easily, and that could be very challenging for you, and that there would be similar impacts with primary energy as well. There are minor changes to the things like the hot water, the glazing and fabric assumptions to try and prevent overheating and various other things, and because of improved science and research that has gone into getting the developments to where they are. One interesting thing that seems quite different is that there's a different approach to how photovoltaics are addressed in the 3 different regions. But in England, it assumes 20% of the area of a roof area is covered with photovoltaics in side-lit building types, whereas 40% in top-lit metal-clad building types. So these proportions are relaxed in proportion to the extent of space heating that's provided by heat pumps. We deliberately kind of built that into our current phase 1 proposals, or that are currently in place. So that would be broadly in keeping with the intention there, but the extent of photovoltaics would be much more. Again, an expectation of low temperature heating systems. Again, there are proposals for works to existing developed buildings. Those proposals are relatively limited, not dissimilar to those for dwellings. We're open in the position of consequential improvements, actually. They apply on particular extensions to larger buildings. So we're open as to whether that should be extended or whether, in effect, it's never really applied. So we'd be keen to get evidence on that, to see how that works, or whether it's working and where we're going with that. And similarly, on major renovations and uplift to services efficiencies, it's largely a case of looking at what's been done elsewhere. So we'll see how we go there, and we'll be interested in what comes back. Section 3C looks at ventilation proposals for dwellings. So in England, these are guidance changes only. They don't change the legislation. So that's kind of notable. The big change is on a restriction to the use of natural ventilation. So if your building is very airtight, there's a concern that that's not going to function sufficiently well to allow natural ventilation to be sure that there's enough robustness in the system, that if people don't open windows or things, that the system that they'll have a healthy building. So with that, they've limited the use of natural ventilation only when you have an air tightness of 3 or greater. So that revises some of the guidance on natural ventilation. In situations where you have a more airtight building, of course, that pushes you to continuous mechanical extract, possibly to MVHR, mechanical ventilation and heat recovery. So you can go with the guidance on continuous mechanical extract, or you can get expert advice. That's a permissible route. If you can demonstrate through that expert advice that what you've done is acceptable, that can get you there. There's a removal of guidance on passive stack type solutions, so that's one of the 4 systems that are currently outlined, but that hasn't been taken up sufficiently to be used. Background ventilators are provided on the basis of rooms rather than whole dwellings. That's a significant enough change in England, and I think we'd agree with that. Room by room is probably a better approach. New guidance on energy efficiency work. Yes, so this is where people are doing energy efficiency work. So maybe you replace your windows 1 year, then you put in loft insulation in a 2nd year. If you add these things up, there comes a kind of tipping point where really you need to review and look at your ventilation. They always say don't insulate without ventilating. So there's a matrix, a little target of major and minor interventions, and that tells you what level of intervention on your ventilation you might need as you accredit and add up these extra measures that have been done to the building. There's a minor thing, which is that the guidance on external pollution is now brought into the main body rather than being in an appendix. Noise and performance validation are also discussed. So we're a little bit concerned about, the noise of mechanical systems and whether they're left on or used and things like that. And then there are two interesting proposals that are worth looking at from Scotland. We're not sure if that could be done in phase 3 or phase 4. We'd be open to your opinion on that. But one is CO2 monitoring in the principal dwelling, in the principal habitable bedroom, the principal bedroom. And the idea there would be that monitor informs people if they're potentially getting high levels of CO2 and not ventilating their property sufficiently well, because the principal dwelling is considered to be the most at-risk space for that. So it gives a kind of doesn't give an audible warning, but it gives a readout or a flashing light somewhere that tells people that they should maybe do something about this and open their window better. And then the other more long-standing measure that they have in Scotland is a more dedicated allowance for clothes drying areas. And with our particular kind of damp and humid environment, with cost of living crisis and people not maybe able to use tumble dryers and things, we wonder if there is maybe scope to think about things. But we do note that requires regulatory change. So that wouldn't just be guidance. Ventilation proposals for building other than dwellings. Again, largely in line with England, but this time they're looking more on the health kind of side of things post-COVID. So there's stuff about recirculating air so that isn't recirculated round and round if there's a particular crisis. So the issue here has been more related to airborne infection and improving the air quality in buildings, and there's a revised table of standards on that and reference to building bulletin documents and things like that. So that's where we're at. That's what's going on there on that section. There's also a section then on mitigation of overheating in dwellings. So there's possibly less risk of overheating here than other regions. However, the new version of SAP 10 has no Appendix P, so an alternative overheating requirement or assessment is required in any case. The document reviews the measures in place in England, Wales and Scotland, and the proposals generally would apply to dwellings and residential type buildings, student and care homes and things like that, but wouldn't apply to non-residential buildings like offices and that, which would be covered by the non-domestic assessment in SBEM. The expectation is that all reasonable passive measures should be deployed before any mechanical or air conditioning is included. Generally speaking, there are two approaches: a kind of effort and a simple approach, which would be a manual calculation, or a modelled approach, which uses dynamic simulation modelling to SIBC TM59. Having reviewed all of this, the proposal put forward is in line with the Scotland's simple approach, which generally, if you've got a cross-ventilated building and you don't have too much glazing, less than 20% of the total floor area of the room, would mean that you could have openable windows similar to those required for purge ventilation under current Part K. So we think that's a simpler assessment than the proposals that have come through in England. So we're advocating that, and we'll see what the feedback is. The other consideration, the issue though can be the other considerations like noise, pollution, security and falls. And if any of those can't be addressed or are an issue at the building, then you probably will have to use the TM modelling method. The TM modelling method has a criterion A and B about nighttime temperatures in bedrooms and things, but it's quite specialised. So there's quite an onerous effort involved in trying to remodel that and check that overheating isn't a substantial risk or is dealt with successfully and hasn't breached the two criteria. The overall outcomes are things like reduced glazing areas, larger total openable areas, so more risk of falling out and things like that need to be watched. More shading, more security grills then to try and be able to get the openable areas to work at night time and things like that. The TM59 approach, from what we're hearing, offers much greater flexibility for designers, so probably is worth getting the relative training for that. But there could also be planning consequences. Having got a design or a building to look a certain way, you then find actually that for this to meet these requirements, you have to take other measures. So we're kind of concerned on that point, or raise that point and let you know about it. There are also proposals in the document then for phase 3 in relation to EV electric infrastructure charging. So these follow up on some requirements from the EPBD, the directive, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which still need to be implemented here. It's really a matter for the Department for Infrastructure, who are leading on it, but other administrations were implemented through building regulations, and the previous ministers were reminded to do so again here. So we're aware that England has chosen to go further than the EPBD and required charge points rather than just the infrastructure, just the ductwork at all new houses that have a parking space associated with them. And the requirements differ. The requirements really, again, from the EPBD are quite complicated to try and work out. There are lots of thresholds, like 10 car spaces, certain requirements apply. In other situations, other things apply. So there's quite a lot to that, and it needs quite a careful and forensic review. So these are some of the issues that we've listed. I'm concerned on time, so I'm not going to go through them all now. But you've got things like the renovation. Well, for a start, there's grid reinforcement cost thresholds. So if the work would need grid reinforcement and that grid reinforcement was expensive, you might find that you were able to be exempt from the requirement, but you've other things to do then in consequence. So it's not a straightforward policy proposal, but it's outlined in the document, and we'd be keen for your input on that. Phase 4 and phase 5 are considered in section 5, and they are outlining some of the kind of current influences and things that are going on. So that includes things like England's future homes and future buildings proposals, and the consequential national calculation work that has gone on that. It's got deals with Scotland's ban on direct emissions heating, which is a really significant manoeuvre. So nothing that combusts anything at your dwelling would be permitted from April 2024. I think it's actually all new builds, dwellings and non-domestic. So you'd have to really have a heat pump or connect to a district heating network or have direct electricity. That's your solution there. And Scotland's commitment to a Scottish equivalent to Passive House from 2025. So we're trying to engage on that and see what's happening there and see how effective that might be. But that could be an influential kind of manoeuvre here in subsequent phases. Boiler and UK product standards are a relative influence because there are measures afoot where or consultation proposals out suggesting that boiler replacements should be at least a hybrid level of performance. So that would increase to better than 100% efficiency because they would use a heat pump effectively. There'd be a heat pump and boiler combination, and that might help mitigate surges on the electrical system or the overall electricity load, so that peaks could be dampened out with the alternative fuel. There's also a plethora of proposals under proposed revisions to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Now that's only European, and whilst we aren't officially obliged to copy or to implement those requirements, they're no doubt likely to be influential in the long term. A lot of the requirements in that new directive, though, are more about requiring work to be done as opposed to standards for work when it is done, which is a building regulations issue. So suggesting things like car parks should be covered with existing car parks should be covered with solar panels and things like that really wouldn't be a building regs issue. But nonetheless, the proposals there are quite extensive, and some of the considerations on things like acoustic and air quality and things like that are all there, and that's all discussed and outlined both in section 5 and in Annex C. So we'd encourage you to take a look at that. Phase 5 is really speculative at this stage, but includes other potential issues, which we'll go on to talk about, but more on smart systems and performances, more emphasis on storage. That might become sort of part of the notional building specifications, that you have an element of storage to accommodate that, or a metric for that. Embodied carbon is another issue that we discuss later. There might be stuff on post-occupation feedback or performance requirements or assurance on construction, such as further testing and validation measures. So again, these are issues that crop up really again in section 6, and we'll come to that. So there's also kind of concurrent issues. Some of these issues are like concerns that people have now that need to be considered, and might influence future developments as well. So one I've mentioned before, which is kind of current grid factors, and there's a table in Appendix B or Annex B, which looks at that, and you'll see different figures there depending on whether you go with the SAP or Ireland's assumption or Northern Ireland's actual carbon estimates. You get quite radically different carbon outcomes for the buildings. So actually option 2, because it's using heat pump electricity, performs worse than option 1 under Northern Ireland's estimate, but would do better under Ireland and would do much better under the SAP assumption. So as the grid decarbonises, you get less benefit for the electricity you've exported back. That's the reason for why that is there. But it's worth noting that SAP isn't necessarily giving you a true representation again of your actual performance in reality in our local conditions. But to develop a whole new local SAP for us would be really, really, really significant undertaking. So but it's something we need to be aware of. So that's something we're mindful of and raise. Similarly, there's a section on embodied carbon and materials. So we're aware of campaigns on this and pressures on this, and we fully accept that your whole life carbon and the embodied carbon's more significant as the operational carbon diminishes. So we're open to consideration on that, but it's a tricky area, and our conclusion is really it's something we need to work with the other administrations on, and potential to encourage whole life carbon assessment alongside current operational metrics. So at the minute, our inclination is to see if we could do something to encourage that, as opposed to requiring it so explicitly, because when we go to require it, it needs very strict rules about admissibility and what, very sure assumptions about proposed lifetimes for buildings and various other inputs that are difficult to establish or gain pan-national agreements on. We have a section with a bit of concern about potential on oversized new homes. There's little point in us improving our emissions performance per metre squared if we build many more metre squareds than are necessary. Every additional metre squared built is adding to the emissions, unless you've got a carbon negative building, which we're not really at. So that's an issue that we think is reasonable to talk about. And particularly because there's some Northern Ireland data suggesting some of our detached homes are really very large, quite a significant proportion of them are. And then we've also got a section there looking at the suggestion about, is there something we could do or learn from to improve in the performance gap, for example, additional testing or validation or commissioning that might be cost effective or that could be done. So we ask these questions and we wait to see what comes back. But these are kind of long-term, concurrent, parallel issues that we're aware of that are influencing all phases, and we'll see what we can do to try and work with that.